Okay, we've got Major Neill Franklin. Once again, Neill, thank you so much for doing these. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So here we go, immigration and drug policies. Why not, right?
Absolutely.
So this is a complex issue. These are two complex issues, and you have volunteered to put these two complex issues together into one conversation. How would you do that? How do you unpack it?
And you're absolutely right. I mean, when you say that, immigration, drug policy, most people think, okay, two separate issues, but they're connected. They're strongly connected. Let me begin. I think I want to begin with immigration real quick because that's what most people are really hearing today. You turn on your cable news, look on social media, and there's all this hype about immigration and the White House and its rhetoric and so on. What's the word? The invasion, right? Well, immigration. Why are folks so desperate to come here from Central America, Mexico and beyond? Why aren't we seeing the same thing from our northern border, Canada, right? We're not talking about building a wall along the Canadian border. In Central America, we have some really severe issues. We have the violence that we see throughout Mexico. We have the violence that we see all throughout Central America, down through Honduras. A couple of years ago, there was a lot of attention drawn to the train of death. This was a train that would travel up through, it was a cargo train that would travel up through Central America to eventually cross the border with goods. And people were climbing, boarding this train, a lot of kids. And when journalists would go interview them, they were saying that they're escaping. Most of them were saying they're trying to escape the violence. Another major reason people want to come here from Central America is for employment opportunities, for a better way of life, for the opportunity to make some money and earn a living. And again, we're not having those problems at the north. So as I begin to connect this so-called immigration problem that we have in the South to drug policy, why are we having the violence throughout Central America? Why are we having this violence in the northern territories of Mexico? It is because of our drug policy here in the United States.
Hold on one second, Neill. How's this our fault?
You better believe it's our fault. This is the country that began the policies of drug prohibition, whether we're talking marijuana, whether we're talking heroin and cocaine. Oh, wait a minute, began those problems of prohibition? Yes, it was all legal at one time. Okay, 100 years ago, you could buy an ounce of heroin for $2.85 at your local drugstore. Bayer was the main producer of it, one of the main producers of it.
Now, the only thing I'm going to take issue with is that you are not adjusting for inflation, but please continue.
Oh, well, here we go. Okay, you're right, not adjusting for inflation.
No, of course, the bigger point, I'm making a silly point. The bigger point here is I could buy heroin at the drugstore, so then there's not going to be any cartel in South America that's going to be in charge of heroin distribution and thus violence in their local nations, right. Thus, having...
we created this policy of drug prohibition. And I know we're not going to take the time to get into the foundation of it a century ago and the social control and the racial implications in bringing about these policies in the country. Let's just say we created the policies of drug prohibition and we pushed it out to the rest of the world. Okay, so it began here, we pushed it out to the United Nations, to the rest of the world. We placed sanctions on countries that did not follow along, with our game plan. And not only did we push these policies of prohibition out, which then moved this drug market into an underground business, which becomes very dangerous as people fight for territory. Just think about alcohol prohibition in the 1920s. Al Capone, Bugsy Siegel, what were they? They were fighting for control of territory. It's the same thing today. That's why we had the St. Valentine's Day massacre and all the shootings. Look, drive-by shootings did not start with today's drug prohibition policies in our inner cities. That's not what drive-by shootings started. They started back in the 1920s with these cats with their Tommy submachine guns hanging off the side of these Model T cars and just spraying neighborhoods as they were shooting at their competitors.
That's why if you have a little platform underneath your door, it's called a running board.
A running board. Absolutely, back then. So these policies today, as people not only try to corner the selling market in territory like we see in our cities, but throughout Central America, it's mainly about trafficking routes. Okay, controlling the trafficking routes. That gave birth to the drug cartels that are fueling the violence in Central America, Mexico, Central America. They're also fueling a lot of the violence right here in our own country. According to the DEA, the cartels are operating in over 1,000 communities across our country from coast to coast. So in Central America, now we have this violence. And you have people and families who are being forced into the illicit drug trafficking trade throughout Central America. People are being forced to come here to the United States illegally to work in the cartel gangs and crews, whether it's in Chicago, whether it's in Atlanta, and other places across the country. And family members are being held literally for ransom back home. You either go to do this, you carry drugs across the border for me, or I kill your kids, okay? Kids are being told, you join our gangs, our cartels, or you leave, or we kill you, okay? So 3 options. You can leave, okay? You can join our gang, or we'll kill you, and your family members. There's that violence. And let's talk about employment, okay? Because that was the other thing I mentioned, employment opportunities. If you are a business person, and I've had conversations with the heads of many companies, business people who will not invest in building out their companies throughout Central America because of the violence. The bottom line with any business is making money. That's the bottom line with the drug trade, making money. The bottom line with any business is making money. And if you will end up losing money by building a business, opening up a factory or other type of facility in a community or an area that's got extreme violence, you're going to lose money. It's no doubt about it. Along with other things, it's just not safe for their employees. It's not safe for them. So therefore, they're not going to do it. Throughout Central America, that country is beautiful, is rich with resources, not just for tourism, but for other types of businesses and industry. But we're just not going to get the businesses to invest because of the violence. So it is the policies of drug prohibition that that have created the violence. Government responds to the violence, creating more violence. You chop off the head like El Chapo Guzman. People are like, oh my God, we captured him. Finally, he didn't escape this time. We captured him. He's going to trial. He's going to be held accountable. That does nothing to quell the violence in Mexico, where he was the head of cartel. As a matter of fact, it causes more violence because now you've split his organization, because the lieutenants at the top are now fighting for control, and now you split into 2 or 3 other organizations that now fight each other, in addition to the other cartels that they're fighting. Then they're fighting the government. So it's just tons of violence, not good for business, not good for raising a family. People want to escape. They want to leave. They come here. They come north by the thousands. Our policies are central to the problems we're having with immigration at our southern border.
So as you are sharing and as one can see, if we just legalized everything, tax and regulated everything, then there is no more illicit market, right? You shared with us during the digital workshop, if you ban menthol cigarettes, all you're doing is creating an illicit market. That lets the illicit market decide on what's going to happen with violence and what's going to happen with enforcement.
The illicit market, in sense, controls the regulations. They set the prices, right? They establish the trafficking routes. They establish the distribution points. They establish who's going to sell and who can sell, which is usually kids, because kids are easier to control. They don't cost as much to employ, right? So if your goal is to keep drugs out of the hands of kids, you just struck out right from the beginning. The other thing I didn't mention is the appetite for these drugs that we have here in the United States, okay, which is another piece of the problem. But again, the appetite is born out of our prohibition policies, because once you've driven it underground into the hands of organized crime and these gangs and crews, again, the number one objective is to make as much money as I can within the shortest amount of time. So my job is to get you addicted. Okay, so I'm going to make this stuff really potent. I remember, I set the regulations. I set the purity levels. I set the quality control standards, which are very little, if any, right? So now I get to get as many people addicted to these drugs as I possibly can, which then fuels and feeds our criminal justice system. Then it puts people, who are using these drugs in a completely different situation once they get arrested for possession. Now, I almost used a curse word on your show, but you think your life was crappy just right. Using drugs?
Right, yeah.
Now you've got a criminal record to go along with it. You got the stigma of being a drug user. Now you've got the stigma of being someone who's convicted of a crime. And now it's a long way back to recover, even if you ever do.
And then here's the link to the mass incarceration conversation that we had, a couple months ago now at this point. Well, there you go. That's how immigration and, drug policy are inextricably linked. Is there anything short of literally legalizing everything, taxing and regulating everything to eliminate this as a problem?
I don't think so. And the key word that you said there was to eliminate. Mm-hmm. You can reduce it by really paying, which we should be doing, paying very strict attention to our addiction problem that we have in this country. Absolutely. Move it from the hands of our criminal justice system for those who are addicted into the hands of healthcare practitioners and mental health practitioners. Yes, absolutely. You can shrink the problem a little bit, but if you want to eliminate the problem, you've got to regulate these things. We've got to go back to where we were before with a regulated market for adult use. Now that can take on many different forms. That can look different one way in one state and another way in another state, just like our alcohol policies do. You go from one state to the next and you'll see different alcohol policies in effect: time, place, use, restrictions, and so on.
But not the big picture.
But that's what we need to do. If you want to eliminate it, if you really want to get it down, the violence down, the illicit trafficking of these drugs.
And if I want to get immigration as a
problem down, you've got to regulate these drugs, and you'll completely wipe out these trafficking routes, along with the violence, along with the you want to make the cartels disappear overnight? Regulate this stuff. You want our neighborhood gangs and crews to shrink dramatically? Regulate this stuff. And then we're only focused on one thing, and that's a health issue, dealing with how people are attracted to and using these drugs. It's a mental health issue first and foremost. And let me just make one thing perfectly clear. The fact that you use these drugs, that you use heroin or cocaine or marijuana, any of these drugs, it does not mean you have a drug problem. Okay? There are people who do. There are people who the use of these drugs become very problematic for their life. We get that, we understand that. But the vast majority of people who use these drugs do not have a health issue with them. They do not have an addiction issue with them. And when I say addiction, I mean using the drugs to the level where your life becomes very problematic because of that relationship.
Yeah. So there's the addiction piece. And, along the way, by legalizing, taxing, regulating, you do significantly decrease this, what has become a gargantuan issue, no matter how you look at it, of immigration,
Yeah. And I'll tell you something else.
You help, you solve that issue, at least in part, by doing this.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you something else. It reduces the rate of consumption of and contact of these drugs with kids in two significant ways. Number one, the gangs and the crews and the cartels are no longer able to hire these young kids to transport and to sell their products.
Amen.
That's number one. Number two, you know what? It's no longer sexy, right? It's no longer the radical thing to do. And we know
we can see in teen use with cannabis legalized, it was real cool, to kind of see what was I not allowed to do when I was, whatever age I was. But now teens don't care in Colorado. Why would they? It's legal.
They don't care. They don't want to do what old people do.
That's it.
They just don't. And if you want to, I've interviewed some kids from Portugal, right, who've now been under this policy of decriminalizing all drugs for close to 15 years now. And I've interviewed some young people who've grown up in this environment over the past decade. And one of the first things they say to me is that, drugs, it's no big deal. That's what old people do. We know they teach us about it in our classrooms twice a year, what drugs are, what they do, how they can become a significant health risk, all that stuff. It's no big deal. It's not sexy anymore.
Eliminated it as an issue by decriminalizing it.
Absolutely. They can't, it's no longer rebellious, right?
Yeah. What are you rebelling against? Exactly.
Absolutely.
Which is why they're all doing math, Neil. I don't even know what that means, but
I'll tell you what it means.
What it actually means.
I'll tell you what it means in my neighborhood here in Baltimore. It means that if I no longer have the opportunity to hang out on a street corner and make $100, $200, $300, $500 a day selling drugs, you know what? My butt's in the seat in the classroom learning math. Because right now, what the biggest attraction for kids leaving the classroom in this city and many cities across the country is that I can go out on the street corner and I can make some cash. And not only am I thinking I can do that, I'm recruited to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Very Fortune 500 style recruitment programs, pulling these kids out of the classroom to the street corner.
And so what I said with humor is actually the case. You get back into the classroom because where else are you going to go?
Very much so.
That's fantastic. Neill Franklin, thank you so much. As always, my friend, I can't wait to the next one already. How about that?
I love it, Seth. Thank you so much for having me on.